Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we present some of the greatest works of English literature adapted for radio right here in Busan. This week, we're bringing you the adventure of the Speckled Band, a bizarre and thrilling Sherlock Holmes murder mystery. In part one of this story, Holmes and Watson are jarred out of bed by the early arrival of a mysterious woman with a harrowing story to tell. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy as we return you to the streets of Victorian London here on BeFM Drama, where I'll be joining you in just a moment as Sherlock Holmes' faithful companion and narrator, Dr. John Watson. In glancing over my many notes of the cases of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find some tragic, some comic, and a large number simply strange. He worked for the love of art rather than for wealth, and refused to investigate the cases that bored him. As a result, many of my stories veer towards the weird and fantastic. Of all these, however, I cannot recall any which presented more unusual features than that associated with the Roylott family of Stoke Moran. The events I describe here took place in the early days of my association with Holmes, when we were still sharing rooms together in Baker Street. It began early in April in the year 1883, when I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing, fully dressed, by the side of my bed. He was a late riser, and since the clock showed me it was barely 7, I blinked at him with some surprise, and perhaps a little annoyance, for I was something of a late riser myself.
Very sorry to wake you, Watson, but it's a common situation this morning. The housekeeper was our first victim. She retaliated by waking me, and now I've done the same to you.
Well, there'd better be a fire or something.
No, it's a client, a young lady. She insists on seeing me. She's in the sitting room now.
At this ungodly hour of the morning? What's the world coming to?
Come now, Watson. In my experience, young ladies wandering the metropolis, knocking people out of bed, often have something pressing they wish to communicate. Should this prove an interesting case, I thought you'd like to follow it from the beginning. Though, of course, if the hour's too early...
Oh, no, dear fellow. I would not miss it for anything.
Good, man. I'll give you 5 minutes. Throw some clothes on and splash a little water on your face. You'll be all right.
I dressed rapidly and was ready in a few minutes to accompany Holmes down to the sitting room. A lady, dressed in black, rose from her seat as we entered, her face concealed by a veil.
Good morning, madam. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my intimate friend and associate, Dr. Watson. Ha! I'm glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has had the good sense to light the fire. Sit a bit closer to it, and I'll order up some coffee. I see you are shivering.
It is not the cold which makes me shiver.
What then?
It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror.
As she spoke, she raised her veil, and we saw her face was pale and strained, with dark circles under restless, frightened eyes. She could not have been more than 30, but her hair was already shot with streaks of gray. Sherlock Holmes ran his eyes over her calmly.
You must not fear. We shall soon set matters right. I see you came by train this morning.
You know me?
The lady stared in bewilderment at my companion.
No, but I do see the second half of a return ticket in the palm of your left glove. You must have left early, but even so, you had a long drive on a bad road and an open cart before you reached the station.
The lady stared in bewilderment at my companion.
I do not mean to startle you, madam. It's just that the left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in 7 places. The marks are fresh, and there's no vehicle but a dog cart that throws mud that way, and only when you sit on the left side of the driver.
You are perfectly correct. I left home before 5 and came in by the first train to Waterloo. I can stand this strain no longer. I shall go mad if this continues. I had no one to turn to. Only one man cares for me, and he can be of little aid. I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes, from Miss Fantosh, from whom you helped in an hour of need. She gave me your address. Oh, sir, do you think you could help me to throw a little light on the darkness that surrounds me? I can't pay you at the moment, but in a month or 6 weeks I shall be married, with control of my own income, and you will not find me ungrateful.
Farintosh. Ah, yes, I recall the case. An opal tiara and a death by bishoping.
Bishoping?
Before your time, Doctor. Never mind. Madam, I would be happy to devote the utmost care to your case. My profession is its own reward, but you may reimburse my expenses after your marriage, should you so wish. For now, simply explain what brings you to my sitting room.
Alas, the horror of my situation lies in the fact that my fears are so vague. My suspicions depend entirely on small points that might seem trivial to another. Even my husband, to be, regards them as the fancies of a nervous woman. But I have heard, Mr. Holmes, that you're able to see through the evils in this world, and perhaps you shall advise me how to walk through the danger that surrounds me.
I am all attention, madam.
My name is Helen Stoner. I live with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran.
Ah, the name is familiar to me.
The family was once among the richest in the country, but 4 successive generations of mismanagement reduced their wealth, and their ruin was completed by the last squire, a terrible gambler. Nothing was left of the fortune but a few acres of land and the ancient family home, which is itself crushed under mortgage debt. The gambler's son and sole heir, my stepfather, saw he must adapt himself to poverty. He took a medical degree and went to Calcutta, where he established a successful practice. This came to naught, however, when, in a fit of anger, he beat his native Indian butler to death.
My God, was he charged?
Yes, and narrowly escaped the gallows. As it was, he suffered a long imprisonment and returned to England a bitter and disappointed man.
May I ask your stepfather's name?
Dr. Roylott, Dr. Grimesby Roylott. He married my mother, the widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery in India. My sister Julia and I were twins, and we were only 2 when mother remarried. She'd inherited a considerable sum of money, £1,000 a year, and she gave it all to Dr. Roylott on the condition that a portion of the annual sum be passed to my sister and I when we were married. Mother died shortly after returning to England in a railway accident, and Dr. Roylott abandoned his attempts to resume practice in London, taking us instead to live in his ancestral home, Stoke Moran. The money my mother left was enough for all of us, and there was no reason we shouldn't be happy.
And yet?
And yet, indeed, a terrible change came over our stepfather when we returned to Stoke Moran. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbors, he shut himself away in his house and never came except to engage in vicious quarrels with whomever crossed his path.
An angry man, this Dr. Roylott?
Violence of temper approaching mania has been hereditary in the men of his family. In my stepfather's case, I believe it was intensified by his long years in the tropics and the term of his imprisonment. Shortly after we returned to the house, a series of fights took place, 2 of which ended in the police court, and soon he became the terror of the village. People cross the street when they see him coming the other way, for he is a man of immense strength and absolutely uncontrollable in anger.
Let's have a few examples of this anger. The details, ma'am, are vital in my line of work.
Well, just last week, he hurled the local blacksmith off a bridge into a stream, and it was only by paying him all the money I could scrape together that I was able to prevent another public scandal. The doctor is eccentric in other ways, too.
Such as?
Well, he has no friends at all, save for wandering transients.
Transients?
Indeed, transients. Dr. Roylott permits the vagabonds to encamp their wagons on the few acres of land which now represent his family estate. In return for his hospitality, they gave him run of their tents, and sometimes he wanders off with them for weeks at a time. He has a passion for exotic animals as well, from Africa and India, which are sent to him by a dealer in such creatures. At this moment, he keeps a cheetah and a baboon, which freely wander around his property and terrorize the local villagers almost as much as their master.
How extraordinary.
And so, you can imagine that my poor sister Julia and I had no great pleasure in our lives. No servant would stay with us, and for a long time we did all the work of the house. She was but 30 at the time of her death, and yet her hair had already begun to gray, even as mine has.
Your sister is dead, then?
At this, Helen Stoner seemed to pale all over. She stared down at the gloved hands resting on her lap, and I saw that they were shaking.
The Speckled Band.
What was that? Speak up, Miss Stoner.
Helen Stoner looked up, and as she did so, I could not help an involuntary hiss of air passing over my teeth. I have rarely seen a woman in such a state of obvious terror. Her face appeared skeletal, and she looked much older than her 30-some years.
The Speckled Band. Yes, Mr. Holmes. My sister is dead. She died 2 years ago. And it's the circumstances surrounding her death that have brought me before you this morning.
What is this mysterious Speckled Band? What does it mean to Helen Stoner, and how does it connect to the death of her sister Julia? Join us tomorrow to find out in Part 2 of The Adventure of the Speckled Band. From BeFM Drama, this is your host, Joshua Cornwell.